Okay, so you want to own a funeral home. It sounds like the safest business anyone has ever invented. Demand never stops. It does not care about interest rates or a recession or whether people feel like spending money this quarter. Every single person in your town is, eventually, a customer. No marketing budget on earth buys that kind of certainty. And the surface numbers seem to agree with you. There are 15,401 funeral homes operating in the United States. They employ around 105,000 people, and together they generate roughly $16.3 billion a year. Divide that out, and the average funeral home is pulling a little over $1 million in annual revenue. For one building on a quiet street in a small town, that is a remarkable number. About 75% of them are still family-owned. Here is the problem. The certainty you are counting on is also a ceiling. And it is a ceiling you have absolutely no power to raise. Because a funeral home is not a service business. It is a standby facility. You are not selling a funeral. You are selling the fact that you were already there, already built, already staffed, already licensed, at 2 in the morning, on the worst day of somebody's life. Almost everything strange about the economics of this business falls out of that one sentence. Let's start with what it costs to be there. A funeral home needs a building that most other businesses would never need. A chapel or visitation space large enough for a crowd you only get a few times a month. A preparation room built like a small operating theater with dedicated ventilation, chemical-resistant surfaces, drainage that meets state health code, and refrigeration for holding remains. A garage. A hearse, which is a purpose-built vehicle that does one job and depreciates the entire time it is parked. Usually a second vehicle to move families or staff. A licensed funeral director, which in most states means a degree program in mortuary science, an apprenticeship measured in years, and a state board exam. None of that scales down. You cannot buy a smaller preparation room for a slow month. The hearse costs the same, whether it runs twice this week or not at all. The license costs the same. The insurance costs the same. The building's heating bill in February does not ask how many families walked through the door. So the fixed cost base is enormous relative to the revenue, and it is almost completely disconnected from volume, which means the entire business collapses into a single question: how many calls do you get? In this industry, a death that a funeral home is asked to handle is called a call. That is the unit. Not customers, not transactions, calls. Now run the break-even math, because it is brutally simple. Take a modest single-location operation with about $300,000 a year in fixed costs. If the average revenue per call is around $4,000, you need roughly 75 calls in a year just to reach zero. Build something larger with $600,000 a year in fixed costs, and at that same average, you need 150. In practice, most standalone funeral homes need somewhere between 100 and 200 calls a year to cover operations and service their debt. A healthy independent tends to run somewhere between 200 and 400. 200 calls a year is roughly 4 a week. Sit with that for a second, because it reframes everything. This is a business with a 7-figure building, a fleet, a licensed professional staff, and a legally regulated facility, and it survives on 4 transactions a week. There is no version of this where you make it up on volume. Volume is fixed by the number of people who die inside a 15-minute drive of your front door, multiplied by the share of those families who call you instead of the place 3 streets over. You cannot create demand. You can only take share. So far, so good. Now let's look at where the money inside a single call actually comes from, because that is where this business gets genuinely interesting. The national median cost of a funeral with a viewing and burial was $8,300 as of the most recent full pricing study by the National Funeral Directors Association. That figure covers the basic services fee, transfer of the remains, embalming and preparation, a metal casket, use of the facilities and staff for the viewing and the ceremony, the hearse, a service vehicle, and a basic printed memorial package. It does not include the cemetery plot, the grave marker, flowers, or the obituary. Those are separate, and they are usually somebody else's business entirely. Now, that $8,300 is not one price. It is a stack. And the way that stack is legally required to be built is the most important structural fact in this entire industry. Since 1984, funeral homes in the United States have operated under a Federal Trade Commission regulation known as the Funeral Rule. Under that rule, a funeral provider must hand anyone who asks a written, itemized general price list. Not a package, not a brochure. An itemized list before any casket is shown. They must give price information over the phone to someone who will not even give their name. They cannot force a family to buy a bundle. A family has the right to decline embalming in most circumstances, and the funeral home has to say so in writing and get written permission before charging for it. And here is the provision the industry fought hardest. A family can buy a casket or an urn from anyone, an online seller, a retail casket store, a warehouse club. The funeral home must accept it, cannot refuse it, cannot require anyone to be present when it arrives, and cannot charge a handling fee for it. If you know someone who is going to have to sit in one of those arrangement rooms in the next year, this is the part to send them. Almost nobody knows those rights exist, and they are federal law in every state. Under that rule, the funeral home is allowed exactly one non-declinable charge, the basic services fee for the funeral director and staff. That single fee is where all the unallocated overhead lives: the building, the 24-hour on-call staffing, the licensing, the compliance. Everything else on the list, in theory, the family can decline. Which tells you exactly how this business is structured. One guaranteed fee that covers standing still, and then a set of optional items that carry the actual profit. And by far the largest of those optional items is the casket. Industry markups on caskets typically run somewhere between 200 and 400% over wholesale. An 18-gauge steel casket, the most common type sold in America, wholesales in the range of a few $100s to about $600. On a showroom floor, that same casket routinely carries a price between $1,500 and $3,000. Move up the range, and the pattern holds. A casket that cost the funeral home around $1,200 wholesale can retail in the $4,000 to $5,000 range. The burial vault works the same way. Most cemeteries require an outer container so the ground does not sink as the casket deteriorates. That is almost never a state law. It is a cemetery policy. A basic concrete grave liner that satisfies the requirement costs a fraction of the sealed metal vault sitting next to it in the showroom. I am not telling you those markups are wrong, and I am not telling you what anyone should buy. Retail markup exists in every industry on earth. What makes this one different is the shopping conditions. You can compare refrigerator prices at 5 stores in 10 minutes. Families choosing a casket are usually 48 hours into the worst week of their lives. They have never seen a wholesale price in their life, and they are standing in a room where the cheapest option is often placed where it is hardest to look at. The Funeral Rule was written specifically because that asymmetry exists. So that is the model as it stood for decades. Low volume, enormous fixed cost, one non-declinable fee to keep the lights on, and a merchandise margin that carried the profit. Now here is the part that changes everything, and it is the reason this business is genuinely difficult in 2026 rather than merely slow. In 2005, cremation accounted for about 32% of American funerals, and burial accounted for about 61%. The National Funeral Directors Association projected the cremation rate at 63.4% for 2025, against a burial rate of 31.6%. Those two numbers have not just moved, they have swapped places. And the association projects cremation reaching 82.3% by 2045. Watch what that does to the invoice. The median funeral, with viewing and burial, is $8,300. The median funeral, with viewing and cremation, is $6,280. But the real damage is not there. It is in direct cremation, where there is no viewing, no ceremony, no casket at all. Traditional full-service funeral homes in mid-size markets typically average somewhere between $7,000 and $10,000 per call. Cremation-focused operations average roughly $2,500 to $4,500. Same building, same preparation room, same hearse, same licensed director, same insurance, same February heating bill. Half the invoice. Every fixed cost in that facility was underwritten by a merchandise margin that a growing majority of families are now declining entirely legally, exactly as the Funeral Rule intended. This is not a story about a business being disrupted by a competitor. It is a business being disrupted by its own customers, quietly choosing the cheaper option that was always sitting on the price list. Which brings us to the mechanism the industry has leaned on to hold the line: pre-need. A pre-need contract is a family paying today for a funeral that will happen at some unknown point in the future at today's prices. From the funeral home's side, it looks wonderful. It locks in market share years in advance, and it guarantees the call does not go to a competitor. But look at what it actually is. You are selling a fixed-price contract with an unknown delivery date and unknown future costs, and you do not get to keep the money. State law typically requires that a large portion, often 70%, and in some states up to 100%, goes into a regulated trust or funds an insurance policy. Some states set it as a percentage of the merchandise retail price, some as a multiple of the wholesale cost. So imagine a contract signed in the mid-2010s for a package a little over $9,000. It comes due more than a decade later. The casket promised in that contract now costs meaningfully more at wholesale than it did when the price was set. Fuel is up. The cemetery has raised its opening and closing fee. The trust earns some investment income, but the funeral home does not simply pocket the difference, and the contract price does not move. You have effectively written a very long-dated option against your own cost base and handed the customer the good side of it. And this is the pressure that has driven the other defining feature of the industry: consolidation. Service Corporation International is by far the largest death care company in the United States, with well over 1,000 funeral homes and hundreds of cemeteries, and roughly 16% of the American market. Its acquisition model is worth understanding because it explains something you may have noticed without registering it. When SCI buys a family funeral home, it usually keeps the family name on the sign. The goodwill and the local heritage are a large part of what was purchased. A study by the Consumer Federation of America found median prices at SCI locations running roughly 47 to 72% higher than comparable independents. So a family drives past a name that has been in their town for 80 years, walks in believing they are dealing with the neighbors, and is looking at a national pricing structure. Now, put the whole thing together and look at a single year. In the good scenario, you are an independent doing 300 calls a year in a market with limited competition, a service mix still weighted toward full traditional funerals, a crematory of your own so you capture the cremation calls instead of losing them, and a pre-need book that is priced with real cost inflation built in. Businesses in that shape trade in the market at a few multiples of owner earnings, and the owner earnings on a single location of that size commonly land somewhere in the $200,000 to $500,000 range. That is a genuinely good outcome for one building. In the realistic scenario, nothing dramatic happens at all. Your local cremation rate drifts up 3 points a year. A direct cremation operator with a storefront and no chapel opens 15 minutes away and takes 40 calls off you because they can profitably serve a $2,000 transaction and you cannot. Your average revenue per call slides from $7,000 to $5,000. Your call count is flat because the number of people dying in your radius did not change, and every one of your fixed costs stays exactly where it was. Nothing burned down. Nobody was sued. Your parking lot still fills up for a service on a Saturday. You simply drifted below the call volume that your building requires, and it happens so slowly that the first hard evidence was the number at the bottom of a spreadsheet. That is the whole business in one line. The people who fail here do not fail because nobody died. They fail because the same building, the same staff, and the same license now have to be paid for out of half the invoice. You were never in the funeral business. You were in the business of being open. And the only question that ever mattered was how cheaply you could afford to stand still. This video is general education about how an industry works, not financial, legal, or funeral planning advice. If you want the actual rules that apply to you, the Federal Trade Commission publishes the Funeral Rule and a consumer guide to it for free, and the Funeral Consumers Alliance publishes free price surveys for many local markets.